Soldiers' hygiene. In 331 BC, Alexander the Great prepared to meet Persian King Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela. On the eve of this monumental battle for Asia, what did the Macedonian king command his troops to do? Shave. While Alexander was following the customs of the Macedonian nobility, for the Greeks in his army the order was very unusual. Culture in Greece at the time held that beards were a sign of wisdom, strength, and honor. According to the ancient writer Plutarch, Alexander believed beards were too easy to be grabbed in battle, whereas more recently, the likes of historian John Boardman suggest that Alexander shaved to look like he had achieved more in his youth. Regardless, the end was the same: beardless men. While many may see Alexander's investment in his appearance as a footnote, the issue of hygiene was of a much more critical importance. Personal hygiene, an often overlooked aspect of military engagements, has decided the fate of many military campaigns, leaders, and civilizations. Long marches across foreign lands often proved more dangerous for standing armies than the actual combat on the battlefield. Up until World War I, more soldiers perished from disease than from engagements with the enemy. With such large volumes of men eating, sleeping, and using the restroom in close proximity to each other, scurvy, typhus, and dysentery posed a constant threat. In one glaring example during the 30 Years' War, Peter H. Wilson estimated that epidemics likely claimed the lives of 75% of the participating soldiers. Good hygiene not only reduced the spread of disease, it could also have strategic military benefits. Plus, maybe we should take a lesson from Alexander's book and make sure to look good for the pages of history. Modern U.S. military. Today, militaries understand the importance of good personal hygiene. It is impossible for an army to be functional if the soldiers are suffering from debilitating diseases. Throughout history, shockingly, around 80% of all reported casualties among U.S. soldiers were attributed to disease or non-combat injuries, or DNBI. And in recent memory, Operation Joint Guardian, which took place in Kosovo in 1999, still saw a substantial 8.1% of all U.S. casualties under the DNBI classification. With time, the U.S. military developed procedures for minimizing the impact of bad sanitary conditions, and the rates of casualties have fallen steadily. By 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom had only 4% of casualties resulting from disease or other non-combat injuries. The U.S. military tackled the issue by ensuring its commanders understood and emphasized the importance of good hygiene. Field sanitation teams were attached to each unit, and soldiers received training and education to become more aware of the threat. Additionally, safe rations, portable water, and showering and bathroom facilities were maintained and readily available for use by soldiers. Medical personnel in the Army were also gifted personal protection equipment and given improved chemoprophylaxis like antibiotics as well as vaccines to prevent medical casualties. However, despite all these new measures, new training for soldiers placed the individual at the front of minimizing disease. Each soldier was expected to take care of their personal hygiene for the betterment of the entire Army. Good individual conduct was imperative in tackling this issue, and each soldier was expected to wash their bodies often, use insect repellent and netting, and avoid food from unapproved vendors. Soldiers' responsibility. Hazards to soldiers come in a variety of ways, from elemental factors such as sunburns and frostbite to personal afflictions such as sleep deprivation. Deployment to a foreign country also exposes Army personnel to new diseases, dangerous plants and animals, and harmful wastes. Soldiers are trained to tackle these challenges by actively responding to the threat. Each soldier must have a supply of personal hygiene materials to maintain a good routine even when they are out in the field. For operatives that are deployed for an unspecified time, it is expected that 90 days' worth of prescription medication and toiletries be packed. Included in this are such things as absorbent body powder, deodorant, a comb, dental floss, hand sanitizer, lip balm, shampoo, and a shaving kit. Skin care. The military understands that the skin is the largest organ of the human body and must be taken care of. As the soldier's first line of defense against disease, the skin is also responsible for protecting against sun rays and insulating the body. Items such as the absorbent powder can be used to control moisture buildup on the skin, and soldiers are encouraged to change socks often and use foot powder to prevent fungal infections. This was a major quality of life improvement from the First World War, where trench foot was a common problem in the damp, cold mud. Additionally, soldiers are expected to apply sunscreen when necessary and allow themselves up to 2 weeks to acclimate to hot environments. Protecting the skin from harsh outside factors is essential in keeping the soldiers healthy. However, skin care does not end there. Soldiers are expected to shower daily under ideal conditions, as frequent showering minimizes the chances of skin infections. When a shower is not available and soaking in a hot tub is out of the question, it is expected that a washcloth and soap be used to cleanse the skin. The Army asks that particular attention should be given to sweaty areas, and places such as the armpits, genitals, and between the thighs need to be cleaned. With all this scrubbing and washing, some may experience dry skin. Interestingly, the Army notes in its official Field Hygiene and Sanitation Handbook that scented lotion, cologne, and perfume are prohibited as they attract insects. Instead, unscented lotion is advised to treat cracked and dry skin. Oral hygiene. Now that the skin has been adequately looked after, it is time to address the teeth. Good oral hygiene demands its own section in the handbook, as soldiers who fail to actively brush and floss their teeth may become non-deployable. Bacteria that lingers in the mouth for just a few days can produce acids that eat away at teeth and cause decay and gingivitis. Not brushing teeth for just one day can cause the gums to become swollen and uncomfortable, so soldiers are advised to brush and floss their teeth at least twice a day. The Army goes so far as to detail how soldiers should use fluoride toothpaste and the circular motion when brushing. It is also recommended not to eat or drink anything for 30 minutes after brushing so that the fluoride has time to coat the teeth. Practicing good oral hygiene is important in minimizing DNBI, but soldiers are also responsible for disposing of their personal waste. Sanitation. Properly disposing of all solid waste and unhealthy human waste is crucial in protecting the health of soldiers and the local environment. Mishandling waste can create hazardous working conditions and slow down the Army's ability to complete missions. Uncle Sam ensures that standards are met in this field by applying criminal penalties to those who neglect to use good sanitation practices. Costly cleanups and strained relationships with local communities are just some of the catastrophic repercussions of failing to follow the Army's guidelines on waste disposal. Soldiers are expected to use portable latrines and dispose of their trash to keep their individual working spaces clean. Portable latrines minimize the occurrence of pests such as rats, mice, and flies by using a collection system. When portable latrines are not available, improvised latrines such as slit trenches and cat holes may be used. However, these practices are all but banned in the United States, and their use in other countries is frowned upon unless the situation is dire. Soldiers are expected to quickly dispose of food-related trash and try to eat in only designated areas to further prevent disease. Waste is always burned, buried, or backhauled. Although some of the regulations on soldiers' hygiene may appear overbearing, the military understands that relaxed standards on any of the aforementioned articles could have disastrous effects. The practices of showering, brushing teeth, and properly disposing of waste are not only to maximize the effectiveness of the unit, they are also there for the soldier's comfort. Clean water is a luxury in wartime, and for most of history, armies have had to contend with undrinkable water in disgusting conditions. Thankfully, today, these issues have been addressed, and military personnel can focus on the tasks at hand without worrying about being able to find drinking water or a place to use the restroom.
How clean were medieval people? Medieval hygiene. Were medieval faces and hands always dirty, clothes tattered and smelly? This may be an unfair image. Hygiene varied between positions in society. Nobles at the top kept clean because of their luxuries and expectations too. If they didn't, it could bring disgrace to the kingdom. But even amongst the majority of common people in medieval Europe, there was an interest in maintaining hygiene and sanitation. Bathing. Most medieval people washed their hands, face, and feet every day, as these were visible to the public. But unless you were aristocracy or nobility, having a private bath in a wooden tub at home was not an option. Public baths were extremely popular during the times of the ancient Romans and Greeks, and even into the medieval times, which the lower-class citizens would use. However, they started to decline dramatically during the start of the 16th century because of the Black Death and the Catholic Church, who were against the bathhouse's immorality. From then on, people became cautious of sharing water with strangers after the threat of the plague, and lower-class citizens preferred to go without baths for weeks or months. Teeth cleaning. There was a desire to keep teeth clean like today. Sugar was rare and costly at the time, and peasants ate a diet of mainly dairy and vegetables, ensuring strong teeth and slow tooth decay compared to later centuries. If a tooth needed to be pulled out, however, it would of course be done without any anesthetic or painkillers. Medieval Europeans practiced their daily dental hygiene by picking food out of their teeth and rubbing them. This minimal dental hygiene came from numerous written manuals. The more refined would follow health manuals which recommended to wash the mouth with wine or vinegar after eating and to rub teeth and gums with rough linen. They also chewed on leaves of mint and herbs to freshen the breath. Toilets. For the elite, garter robes were private toilets within their own rooms, found in castles or monasteries. The toilet resembled a hole in a wooden or stone seat. This would be connected to a shaft leading all the way down into the moat or cesspit, which the waste would travel down. For most people, chamber pots were a common form of household toilet as a portable solution for carrying waste outside. Outhouses and seats with holes above a trough also existed in medieval times. For toilet paper, medieval people used hay or straw, or if they could afford it, cloth or linen scraps. Streams and rivers that flowed near the towns acted as sewers to carry away the waste, or if more fortunate, the town may have had old Roman drainage systems. But how did people dispose of waste in towns where there were no streams or rivers? The famous image of people throwing filled chamber pots directly out of their windows onto the streets below may not have been as common as it seems. Such motivations may have been the dangers of going outside at nighttime, or just laziness. Nevertheless, throwing waste outside windows was illegal, and there were fines against it in the interest of sanitation. Informers were even employed to catch out people breaking this law. The legal solution for such towns was cesspits, and gong farmers were employed to do the undesirable job of cleaning out these cesspits of waste.
How did the Romans go to the toilet? For many of us in the modern world, a conveniently located toilet that efficiently and safely removes our bodily waste is a luxury that we take for granted. If we were to step back in time approximately 2,000 years ago, we would see that life for the ancient Romans was not always quite so easy. The Roman water and waste management system was a truly impressive feat of ancient engineering. Massive aqueducts stretch for miles over the countryside, bringing fresh water to fountains and bathhouses in the towns and cities of the empire. In fact, the system was so good that some parts of it, such as the Cloaca Maxima, ancient Rome's main sewer, which is believed to have been built circa 600 BC, are still operational to this day. Public toilets, or phorica, which were often built in the vicinity of bathhouses and fountains, made use of the runoff water from these facilities to provide their patrons with an early form of flushing toilet. These toilets were a little different from what we're used to today, mainly in that they were almost completely lacking in privacy. The walls were lined with inward-facing benches with a row of holes, usually about 30 centimeters apart, running along top. There were no dividers, no cubicles, and larger versions could accommodate up to 30 users at a time. The only concession to privacy was provided in the form of a second row of keyhole-shaped holes cut into the front of the benches. These were most likely there to allow people to clean their backsides without having to stand up. A small channel ran just in front of the benches, the purpose of which is not entirely clear, but it most likely held water, either to help the ancient Romans clean themselves or to assist with cleaning the facilities. Underneath the benches, a continuous flow of water was designed to eliminate waste and, at least in theory, minimize any unpleasant odors. Despite this measure, the famous senator Cicero is known to have lamented the stench of the public toilets and requested that they be kept away from him. Another thing that would have been lacking was toilet paper, as this was not to be invented for some centuries and was utterly unheard of by the Romans. Instead, they used a tessorium, or a sea sponge on a stick, and yes, these were also communal. Another type of public toilet existed in the form of amphorae, which were a common sight outside fullers' shops, as urine played a vital role in cleansing cloth. For rich Romans, things were a little different. The Villa Adriana, one of Emperor Hadrian's favorite residences, provides a great example of how a person's class affected the type of toilet that was available to them. For members of the imperial elite, the emperor and his immediate family, there were several single-seater toilets. Below this, there were communal toilets that were nicely decorated and had dividers offering a degree of privacy. These were probably used by the emperor's guests and other lower members of the court. Finally, there were the servants' toilets, which were similar to the previously described phorica. In-house toilets were not just for the super-rich of the Roman world. There are many examples from across the empire that can be found in the private dwellings of everyday citizens. Although most of them could not afford the luxury of running water like Hadrian, and instead relied on cesspits. These were covered either with a wooden or stone seat with a hole cut in the top. The Romans had no concept of germ theory and liked to throw their household rubbish into the pit, which was often located either in or right next to the kitchen. When a cesspit was full, its contents would be collected by a manure merchant and sold as fertilizer. One item that virtually all Romans would have been familiar with was the chamber pot. These could either be specifically designed vessels or recycled pots and jars, the contents of which would either be disposed of into the communal cesspit or simply tossed out into the street. This prompted the poet Juvenal to comment that one should be wary, venturing out after dark without having made a will, and should be grateful to only be hit by the contents rather than the pot itself. Finally, if there were no other options available to them when nature came calling, there is good evidence that many ancient Romans would just go wherever they could. Literary sources suggest that men were likely to relieve themselves in alleyways, public fountains, and against statues, amongst other places, and there are multiple examples of graffiti imploring people not to defecate in certain public places. In fact, it's possible that some people would have preferred going in the open than facing a public toilet, as some evidence suggests that ancient Romans believed more than just bad smells emanated from their toilets. This was a superstitious time, and there was a pervasive belief that demons and other creatures lived in the sewers. Magical spells that were designed to ward away such beings have been found inscribed on the walls of several Roman toilets. The writer Claudius Aelianus tells the story of an octopus who emerged from a toilet each night on a quest for food. Whilst this story was almost certainly apocryphal, the rats and creepy crawlies that did make the sewers their home likely gave more than one unsuspecting Roman a nasty surprise, and are more than enough to make us grateful for the wonders of modern plumbing.
Why were sailors so unhealthy? 16th to the 18th century. As the British Empire spread across the globe in the 16th and 17th centuries, a whole new set of challenges started to emerge, like how to live at sea for many months without letting most of your sailors get sick or die. From the 16th to the 18th century, the entire world went through great political and cultural transformations due to the exchanges happening through sea trade. The sea had become the main scenario of world politics. As longer and longer voyages became more common, sailors started to become afflicted with a strange and horrible disease. It would appear after just a few weeks at sea, and at first it was just an unexplained weakness and fatigue, accompanied by a slight fever and an increased irritability. But if the condition continued, after a few months, it would become increasingly more severe, as a sailor's gums would become sore and start to bleed, followed by tooth loss as well as agonizing headaches. The sailors' joints would then swell up and become painful and tender. Their eyesight would also deteriorate, their vision becoming blurred and sensitive to light. Then jaundice would set in, where the skin and eyes start to yellow, and soon after that, the victim would fall into a coma and die a short time later. But oddly, if they made it back to land and were given the chance to rest and recuperate, they would mysteriously make a full and speedy recovery. Such it was that a lot of sailors had the disease many times in their lives. At this stage, the commonly held view was that scurvy, as it was being called, was a digestive imbalance caused by the hardships of life at sea and the naval diet. Others believed it was caused by excess of black bile or laziness. The standard Royal Navy diet at the time lacked fresh meat, and the crew had to rely upon salted pork and beef for their protein, along with whatever fish and turtles they could catch. Their weekly ration during the 18th century consisted of 6 pounds of salted meat, which was the equivalent of the meat from 24 quarter-pound burgers. Along with this were small quantities of butter and cheese and a large amount of biscuit and oatmeal, totaling around 10 pounds. The biscuit was called hardtack and was inexpensive, being made from flour, water, and salt. Its major drawback was that it was tasteless and prone to bug infestations like weevils, a small, ugly, snout-nosed insect. There was also a daily pint of beer per man, along with a watered-down shot of rum. If times were tough, rats would be caught and eaten, which had the added bonus of keeping the onboard vermin population under control. But most importantly, fresh fruit and vegetables were only served for the first part of the voyage, as they would eventually spoil. So for most of these long trips, the sailors' diets completely lacked any source of vitamin C. So to try and cure scurvy, the Royal Navy introduced a number of measures, like increasing the beer ration, introducing the eating of sauerkraut, which was a fermented cabbage, and issuing a sugary drink made of malt and a thing called wort, which was a side product of the brewing process. None of these were particularly effective. In fact, one of these so-called cures was actually extremely dangerous to one's health. It was called the elixir of vitriol, consisting of sulfuric acid taken with alcoholic spirits that were infused with a mixture of various spices and mixed with barley water. Soon, this mysterious affliction was causing such a problem on long-distance voyages that the Royal Navy was forced to take action, because up to 50% of those sick with scurvy died in the beginning of the age of sail, and still 1 in 7 sick sailors died of it in the 18th century. Around this time, it was not just the fleets of the great European powers that were suffering from the ravages of scurvy. Pirates, who were a major world problem in those days, also suffered greatly. In some ways, pirates were hit even harder by scurvy, as they were limited by where they could pick up fresh supplies as they were outlaws. To aid them was punishable by death. So they were often forced to rely on food supplies from the ships they plundered, which often meant their diet was even more deficient in vitamin C than the likes of the British or French navies. And to complicate matters further, pirate ships rarely carried any kind of doctor on board, so pirate ships often relied on good fortune when it came to injury or disease, and a man handy with a saw if it was time for an amputation. The famous pirate Blackbeard was unusual for his time and insisted on keeping a well-stocked medicine chest on board, with a selection of herbs, assorted knives, razors, cauterizing irons, cupping glasses, stitching quill, and needles. Then, in 1747, a Scottish doctor named James Lind, aboard the British warship HMS Salisbury, in his experiments, discovered a link between a sailor's poor diet at sea and the true cause of scurvy, and that it might be cured by eating fresh citrus fruit. But his findings were overshadowed by his work on clinical medical experiment methods and the importance of good hygiene, causing his work on scurvy to be overlooked. In 1793, the much-respected Rear Admiral Gardner insisted, after being advised by the physician Gilbert Blaine, that some of his ships heading on a 4-month voyage to India carry lemon juice to be issued every day to the crew. Gardner had seen firsthand how ineffective the so-called cures for scurvy were, but had been impressed by how the Spanish Navy was getting the problem under control by regular doses of lemon juice. There was much astonishment when his small fleet of ships arrived in India, and not a single crew member had gone down with scurvy the entire trip, something completely unheard of at the time on such a long voyage. The Royal Navy's Sick and Hurt Board quickly recommended to the British Admiralty that lemon juice be issued as a daily ration to the crews on all British warships in the future. Gilbert Blaine was appointed as the commissioner to the Sick and Hurt Board in 1795 and used his experience with the results Gardner had shown to persuade the Admiralty to issue lemon juice as a daily ration to the entire Royal Navy fleet. Almost overnight, scurvy became a thing of the past. In time, science identified that scurvy was not a disease or ailment, but in fact a deficiency in vitamin C caused by a lack of fresh fruit and vegetables.
The Rotten Royals of Old England. The British monarchs of the modern era are cultured, educated, and well-mannered. They exude sophistication, class, and elegance, acting as a moral figurehead to their subjects. However, the English kings and queens of the medieval and early modern period were a far cry from their more refined and polished descendants of today. The English monarchs of the past were disgusting, crude, and brash. Many of their habits, customs, and actions are considered impolite, rude, or gross by today's standards, and they often overindulged in their respective vices. William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror, England's first Norman king, was a short-tempered and merciless ruler who grew obese later in life due to his fondness for excessive food and drink. William, Duke of Normandy, defeated Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon king of England, at the decisive Battle of Hastings in October 1066. He was crowned king on Christmas Day of the same year. William had a well-documented short temper and had extraordinary fits of rage. In one instance of bad sportsmanship, he smashed a chessboard over the head of a French prince after losing to him in a game of chess. As William grew older, his anger was matched only by his gluttony, both of which may have contributed to his early death and disastrous funeral. William's stomach grew so large in his later years that even portly Philip I of France commented on William's extraordinary potbelly, stating that William looked pregnant. In 1087, William made a claim on the French county of Vexin, demanding the territory from Philip. The French king rejected William's claim. The corpulent William then led a raid on the French town of Mantes, where he fell over the front side of his saddle, possibly due to his protruding stomach. William fatally damaged his internal organs and died about 5 to 6 weeks later from an infection caused by his injuries. At William's funeral, the servants attempted to stuff his long, bloated corpse into an undersized tomb, with catastrophic results. His decaying body burst open and his putrid innards filled the room with a horrific stench. A nasty end to nasty habits. Edward III. Edward III was a famously foul medieval monarch who pushed England into the 100 Years' War with France. After his mother Isabella of France deposed her husband, King Edward II, with the help of her lover, Lord Mortimer, Edward ascended to the throne of England in 1327 at the age of 14. The young King Edward III was essentially a puppet of his mother and Mortimer until he stripped her of political influence and had Mortimer executed in 1330. Although Edward rose to power as a young teenager, led England into a devastating war with its cross-channel rival, and ruled during the Great Plague outbreak, he will always be remembered for the disgusting habits of his childhood. As a child, Edward had filthy fingernails and had dirty habits when being taught his lessons, such as reading. According to his teacher, Edward would eat cheese and fruit while he read, spilling the crumbs and juice all over his books. Edward also let his nose run onto the pages of his reading material. Henry VII and Henry VIII, Groom of the Stool. The Tudor monarchs appear to display an air of pomp and grandeur, but they may in fact be England's messiest royal dynasty. The first Tudor monarch, Henry VII, was crowned King of England in 1485 after he defeated and killed the Yorkist King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. By 1495, Henry VII created the Privy Chamber, a team assembled to manage the king's private quarters. One member of the Privy Chamber held a unique position that was prominent, highly sought after, and frankly, quite disgusting. That position was the Groom of the Stool, a truly messy job. The Groom of the Stool's responsibility was to handle all matters relating to the king's bodily excrement. He tended to the king's portable toilet, known as a stool, and made sure water, towels, and a wash bowl were available for the king upon the completion of his business. The groom was also responsible for cleaning out the king's stool. Upon the monarch's death, the groom was given the king's chamber pot and stool as a keepsake of his grossly intimate royal duties. This role may seem foul and undesirable, but by the end of Henry VII's reign in 1509, the Groom of the Stool had become a highly coveted and an incredibly influential position. The groom wielded immense power due to his intimate relationship with the king, and he was assigned a variety of important administrative tasks completely unrelated to royal waste. Henry VIII's first Groom of the Stool, Sir William Compton, was a close advisor to the king and was tasked with running the Privy Chamber, handling the king's finances, distributing alms on behalf of the crown, and organizing the king's massive collection of goods needed when he and his entourage were traveling around the country, visiting courtiers and clergy. Just to emphasize the sheer scale of this exercise, the king's entourage could number 750 courtiers and staff in the summer, and as many as 1,500 in the winter. Compton benefited greatly from his position and became one of the wealthiest men in Tudor England. Indeed, the chamber pot wielded great power. However, Compton's replacement, Henry Norris, did not share the good fortunes of his predecessor. Norris was accused of conspiring against Henry VIII and committing adultery with the king's second wife, Anne Boleyn. He was beheaded along with the disgraced queen in 1536. Ultimately, the power of the pot only went so far. Elizabeth I. The Groom of the Stool's importance waned in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the role was eventually done away with in 1837 by Queen Victoria. But that didn't eliminate the nasty habits of the royal rulers. During the reign of Elizabeth I, which lasted from 1558 to 1603, the Groom of the Stool was temporarily replaced by the Lady of the Bedchamber. Although the queen didn't have a groom of the stool, she was nevertheless a very messy monarch. In the Middle Ages and early modern period, bathing was an infrequently performed and uncommon practice. Elizabeth rarely bathed, rumored to have bathed only 4 times a year, whether she needed it or not. As Europeans began to explore and exploit the New World in the 16th century, sugar from the Americas flooded into Europe. With royal access to this new temptation, which was perceived as a status symbol, Queen Elizabeth fell victim to a nagging sweet tooth. She ate so much sugar that her teeth ultimately began to rot and turn black. It was said that she placed a perfumed handkerchief in her mouth before receiving guests to disguise her bad breath. It is ironic that the Tudors used a polish on their teeth that was actually made of sugar and so exasperated the problem. If the sugar habit wasn't enough, the queen also fell victim to smallpox during her reign, leaving her face etched with ugly scars and pockmarks. Elizabeth also used a heavy white makeup known as Venetian ceruse to mask her facial scarring. Venetian ceruse contained white lead pigment, a material that could potentially cause lead poisoning and madness. Along with questionable hygiene, Elizabeth had quite a temper. On one occasion, she swore at a courtier and spat on him because his coat displeased her. One can only imagine the foul experience of being covered in saliva and shouted at by this bad-tempered royal. James I. Elizabeth's younger cousin and successor, James I, England's first king of the Stuart dynasty, was another unhygienic monarch who rarely bathed. James hated water and never completely washed his hands. He merely brushed the ends of his fingers with a slightly wet napkin. James's poor hygiene caused him to itch constantly, and he produced a vile body odor because he refused to change his clothes. James only actually changed outfits when his clothes became completely worn out. This king also frequently slobbered and picked his nose. As one can see from the generations of English monarchs, nasty habits, horrific hygiene, and royal rudeness took a seat on the throne alongside the reigning ruler.
The weird history of toilet deaths. Toilets may seem harmless. After all, we use them multiple times a day, but don't be fooled. These disarming devices have caused a surprising number of deaths throughout history. Let's take a look at a few of them today. Taking the plunge, the Erfurt latrine disaster, 1184. In the year 1184, in the German town of Erfurt, there was one particularly infamous toilet disaster. Nobles had traveled from across the Holy Roman Empire in an attempt to negotiate peace between the feuding Louis III of Thuringia and Archbishop Conrad of Mainz. Nobles took their seats in an annex of St. Peter's Church, eagerly awaiting for the assembly to begin. But no sooner had the gathering commenced when, all of a sudden, the wooden floor of the annex collapsed, sending the men plummeting into the latrine in the cellar. All in all, it's estimated that 60 people drowned in the excrement below. Sponge on a stick, Roman infection circa 753 BC to 476 AD. Romans had a pretty sophisticated sanitation system for their time, but they were not immune to the dangers of toilets. Since toilet paper hadn't been invented yet, they used sponges on a stick to clean themselves up. These sponge sticks were considered communal, however, and were shared between strangers, passing along intestinal parasites with them. If you were wealthy enough to have a toilet in your home in this period, you might have been even worse off in certain circumstances. Toilets usually drained straight down into cesspits, which were often located right next to the kitchen. As a result, this generally enabled bacteria and parasites to travel up into the home where food was prepared. What's worse is that the river Tiber was known to have flooded on occasion, sloshing human waste up into people's homes. Not only did this contribute to rife dysentery and roundworm in Rome, but it stunk a whole lot too. Bathroom butchery. Godfrey the Hunchback, 1069. Not all toilet deaths were accidental, though. In 1069, the Counts of Flanders and Holland desired to get rid of their enemy, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, Godfrey the Hunchback. They went about this by hiring an assassin who found a creative way to execute his plan. In the middle of the night, he snuck underneath the latrines that had been built into the side of the castle wall next to Godfrey's bedroom. When Godfrey woke up to relieve himself, the cunning assassin stabbed him up the rear end with a spear. It took a few days for Godfrey to die, but the assassination was a success. Explosive diarrhea. Toilet explosions from ancient to Victorian times. From ancient Rome right through to the Victorian era, it was not uncommon to hear reports of exploding toilets. This proved a particular issue with public latrines, which saw a lot of use before ordinary households gained access to running water. If release valves were not working properly, the buildup of noxious gases could sometimes increase pressure until boom. This generally resulted in serious injuries, from cuts and burns on the backside to actual fatalities. With a chance of being launched into the air at your local latrine ever present, maybe it's not so difficult to understand the growth in popularity of the private toilet. Stinking ships. German submarine U-1206, 1945. Fast forward to 1945. On board the German submarine U-1206, an engineer had been called in to investigate when the toilet was found to have been acting up. Mistakenly pulling the valves in the wrong order, however, the engineer stood by helplessly as seawater gushed from the toilet into the main hull, where it reacted with a battery on the ship. The contact between the two substances generated deadly chlorine gas, forcing the crew to quickly return to the surface to release it. But as they resurfaced, they were spotted by British planes who promptly sunk the German vessel. Many of the crew managed to survive by deploying life rafts to get them to shore, but 4 crew members died as a result of the malfunction. So, what are your thoughts on toilets now? Suddenly, they don't feel so safe. Let us know in the comments below.
The Plague Doctor, the 17th century. In Italy, 1656 through 57, devastating outbreaks of bubonic plague in Naples, Rome, and Genoa killed approximately 200 to 400,000 people. It's unknown where this deadly plague originated, but it's said to have spread from Naples, where restrictions and precautions were non-existent. In these cities, plague doctors were hired to treat plague patients, especially for the poor who could not afford treatment. The doctor's costume was designed to protect them from what was thought of as evil smells or bad air, which was seen as the cause of infection at the time. This is now known as the medically obsolete miasma theory. In reality, the plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which exists in fleas found on rats. The infected would have flu symptoms followed by swollen and painful lymph nodes, gangrene, and vomiting of blood, with death following within a week from infection. Some historians point to Charles Delorme as the inventor of the costume, which was modeled after soldiers' armor. The most striking feature was a birdbeak-like mask with crystal glasses. The mask was more than aesthetic and acted as a respirator filled with dried flowers or spices, which the doctor breathed through, protecting them from contagions. The doctor would also wear a long Moroccan leather gown that tucked into the mask to prevent contact with the patient, and the surface was waxed to prevent miasmas sticking to the surface. A friar named Father Antaro Maria da San Bonaventura observed that those who worked in the plague house while wearing the waxy robe did not catch the disease. He noted that it stopped fleas nesting on the person and was therefore close to discovering the true reason behind the plague. Unfortunately, he discounted the fleas as merely an annoyance rather than carriers of the disease. And furthermore, as the clothing didn't protect the wearer from miasmas, he would discount the value of waxed robes as well. The doctor would also wear gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat to show his profession, and hold a wand or cane to examine and issue instruction without touching the patient. Methods of treatment for the miasma, which was really the plague, were ineffective. Remedies included bloodletting and the use of leeches on the affected areas. Prescriptions of toads or spiders were also given to absorb the bad air. The plague doctor's appearance was quite terrifying for patients, as it was a sign of impending death, and they were kept out of the way of the public due to the nature of their profession.
Disgusting jobs in history. Tosher. Toshers, or sewer hunters, were people who ventured into the filthy sewers looking for valuable items, such as copper coins or gold to sell on. Victorian London was becoming a crowded, urbanized metropolis, and the sewer network was under great pressure to wash away the growing population's waste. This disgusting job offered many dangers. The dark tunnels often crumbled under deterioration, which could bury you alive. You could get lost in the complex maze-like network of the London sewers. There was risk of suffocation from breathing in pockets of noxious fumes or foul air. Sometimes when the sluices were lifted, a rush of water entered the sewers, posing a risk of drowning in excrement. And the most feared threat, rats. Swarms of rats hid in the dark shadows waiting to attack. The rodents were rampant in Victorian cities and caused disease. One tosher said when a rat bite is bad, it festers and forms a hard core in the ulcer, which throbs very much indeed. This core is as big as a boiled fish's eye. There are accounts of swarms of rats overpowering sewer hunters, tearing them to pieces, and to be discovered by their fellow toshers washed up on the Thames the next day. This is why toshers preferred to move into the sewers in gangs of 3 or 4, led by an experienced veteran. Toshers used a variety of tools for the job. As well as carrying lanterns for the dark tunnels and a pan for sieving raw sewage from valuable items, toshers carried a pole around, which was 7 or 8 feet long with a large iron hoe on the end. This vital tool was used in case the tosher sank into a quagmire, enabling him to attach onto something solid to pull himself out. It could also be used to dig through rubbish and uncover the treasure they were looking for. Toshers wore long coats with large pockets for holding the items they collected, canvas trousers, and old slops for shoes. They also wore a canvas apron and carried a bag on their side. After 1840, it was made illegal to enter the London sewers without permission because of the dangers they posed. Large fines or even prison time were enforced if detected, and informers were rewarded handsomely. So toshers switched to working at night by lantern light. Even though the job was highly undesirable, toshers thought of themselves as above mudlarks, people who searched the Thames for coal, wood, or rope. As they were searching for more valuable items, such as gold or silver, they were thought of as the elite of the scavengers. They also made a good living at around 6 shillings a day, putting them in the top earners of the Victorian London working class.